Hello and welcome back. Today we're talking about the relationship between religion and philosophy, both in the Islamic world and in the Christian world. Um, there's also a similar relation in Judaism, which it's in the reading, but I didn't spend as much time in this lecture. There's just so much to cover. We can't cover everything. So the main focus will be in Islam and in Christianity. Here we have Saint Anselm here. Uh, we'll see his proof of the existence of God later in the lecture. So around the 800s AD, so remember, Muhammad was 600 AD, so this is a couple hundred years after Muhammad. Um, Nestorian Christians, again, there were still, various brands of Christianity, uh, as there are today, right? You've still got Methodists and Catholics, and it's always sort of been that way with Christianity from the beginning, and it's never really stopped. Um, so we had Nestorian Christians, and they were Syrian, and they were translating the works of Plato and Aristotle and the uh, earlier Christian Greek thinkers into Arabic. And this allowed Muslim scholars to study um, various Greek texts in math, medicine, astronomy. They also, of course, had their own store of scientific knowledge. At this time, Islam was the caliphate was dominating the region. You had an Islamic empire at this time called the Abbasid Caliphate. So, they had their own scholars, and they were bringing in uh, knowledge from the Greeks. These in these times, it's not that there wasn't progress, but it wasn't like it is today, where the science of 50 years ago is almost obsolete, right? You could sort of rediscover knowledge developed by the Greeks, and it would be, a supplement instead of saying, well, geez, this is hundreds of years old, right? So things moved more slowly back then. So this kind of knowledge was called falsafa, right? So it sounds like philosophy, and it's the equivalent of philosophy, and the scholars were called philosophers or philosophs, right? Um, so you recall Muhammad had identified Allah with the God of the Jews and the God of the Christians. Um, these philosophers identified Allah with the gods of Greek philosophy as well. Aristotle's unmoved mover, Plato's realm of the forms. So this was a tendency in, at least early on in Islam, to bring it all in and say, yes, it's all the same, right? It's all the same God. And at least at this time, sort of in the 800s AD, Muslims were actually getting kind of a head start over Christians on trying to incorporate philosophy or make Islam compatible with cutting edge philosophy. I mean, it's not that no Christian, we surveyed some brands of Christianity that used Platonism, um, but the mainstream Christian approach was uh, Christianity is not a scientific thing, right? It's a spiritual experience. It's a revelation. Um, Salvation is not something you can reason yourself into, right? This was still the mainstream Christian view. Um, the Muslims didn't see it that way. They thought Islam and philosophy could be perfectly compatible, and you could come to know the truths of Islam using rationality, um, just as remember the caliphate, uh, which we haven't talked much about the politics, right? But it was a religious state. So the caliph was thought to be, related to Muhammad, and he was a spiritual leader, religious leader, as well as a political leader. Uh, so there's a unity there between the uh, political and the religious, and these Islamic scholars thought, yeah, and there can also be, in addition, a unity between science and logic and rationality and the religious and the political, and it's all can be one coherent whole, right? A unified view of reality. But then, as now, it's not so easy to come up with a unified view of all reality and human endeavors and the spiritual. So there were problems to be solved. The Greek god of philosophy, on, Aristotle's unmoved mover, right, on the face of it, doesn't look a whole lot like the Allah of the Quran, who is, speaking through uh, Muhammad and commenting on contemporary affairs, right? The Greek Aristotle's God is completely disconnected from human affairs, apart from the fact that we he gives us our source of being, but that's about the limit of his involvement with us. Um, and then also they were just, reality is not very unified and coherent, right? There's war, there's illness, there's misery and despair. This doesn't, and again, this comes up, for contemporary religious people. It's called the problem of evil. Um, if a rational, loving, all-powerful God created this perfect universe that hangs together, um, why are people getting cancer left and right? Why are children dying and so on? So these are not new problems, right? They're not problems that have been solved, but they were problems for these Islamic scholars. But they were attempting, right? The mainstream, most Christians at that time were not even bothering with it, didn't think it was something that could be answered. The Islamic scholars thought it could, particularly because this was a young religion. There was a lot of energy and a lot of excitement, right, about um, potentially solving all these problems. We're looking back uh, over 1,000 years later and saying, a little skeptically, but at the time it seemed like sure we're on the verge of getting this all worked out, right? So they were ambitious and young and energetic, and we'll look at some of the more prominent Islamic scholars and their work. So creating a unified philosophical view of, again, religion and science and everything uh, requires a different approach than Muhammad's approach, and the approach that from which the religion came, right? So these, if you read the Bible in particular, it's largely it reads somewhat like a history of humanity, and it's got these particular main characters. You've got Abraham and Moses and Jesus, and they're doing things in the real world, and they're interacting with real empires, um, and this is not the sort of thing that philosophers typically do. So the philosophs, they change their perspective, right, from starting with the concrete and historical and looking at the completely abstract and the completely general, right? And then from there, maybe you can deduce particular truths, but they're trying to get the big sort of laws of rationality and nature to all hang together. So, to take one example of the sort of thing they're trying to work out, if you read the Bible, many people took the accounts in Genesis to be saying that God created the universe ex nihilo, meaning from nothing, right? He just popped something into existence from nothing. But it's among the philosophers, the Greeks in particular, and then these Islamic scholars, they took it to be a general principle that nothing can come from nothing, right? Things don't just pop into existence from nowhere. Everything needs a cause. Everything needs a context or a energy. So one way I try to explain this, the way Aristotle thought about it, right? So suppose I don't think I have a dollar on me, but suppose I'm holding up a dollar, right? And you might ask, where did this dollar come from? And I could tell you, well, I got it in change from the supermarket. Where did the supermarket got it? Well, somebody bought a pack of cigarettes with it. Where did they get it? Maybe they got it from the bank and on and on. But ultimately the dollar has to come from somewhere, right? It doesn't just it's not dollars all the way back, right? There's not just infinite dollars in the background, and the dollar has to be caused by something. It had to be produced. This is the story of sort of the way science and causation worked at the time, right? And these Islamic scholars wanted to be in that mainstream science of the time, and it just didn't seem to uh, mesh with the at least the way people were interpreting the Bible. Um, and so these philosophers said, okay, well, people are interpreting, let's not worry about what the Bible says or how people interpret the Bible. We know rationally that you can't get something from nothing, and therefore creation can't be ex nihilo, right? It has to be something else. Another way that sort of so many of these scholars were Shiites. Remember the Shiite-Sunni split, right? So the two main types of uh, Muslims who the difference, initial difference being they claim a different descendant of Muhammad to be the rightful leader of the Ummah of the community, because remember Muhammad didn't have any sons, so the line of succession wasn't clear, and there was some uh, argument over who was the proper descendant, proper leader, and so the Shiites and Sunnis had different positions on that question. Um, so many of these philosophers were in the Shiite tradition, and in the Shiite tradition, you've got an imam who is the both the political and the spiritual leader of the Ummah, right? And some of these Shiite philosophers saw parallels with the imam and uh, the philosopher king of Plato. So Plato wrote a book called The Republic. It was one of his later works, and it's an explanation of the ideal state, right? Of the ideal, political uh, setup. And it's a long book and there's a lot to be said, but one of the things Plato thought was that the leaders of the society shouldn't be like just the richest people or like the most popular or the, whatever the best at political wheeling and dealing. They should be the smartest and the best, right? And so for Plato, that would be a philosopher, because in particular, because philosophers at the time, it's not that they just studied mathematics and logic, they studied ethics and justice, right? And the idea of the philosopher was, I want to be the best person I can be, right? I want to know the good and pursue it. And so for Plato, that seemed like, yeah, obviously, that's the person that should be running our country. And so these Islamic scholars saw the imam as that, right? As someone who studies the Quran. And again, there's no contradiction between philosophy and the Quran and all this stuff. And so that, yeah, he's our philosopher king. So if creation is not ex nihilo, um, how did God create the universe? What's the alternative? And so Plotinus, who was a Greek philosopher, invented this notion of emanation, right, in answer to this question, and Muslim scholars latched on to this notion of emanation as an alternative to creation ex nihilo. So emanation is not causation, right? Because this was the whole problem. Uh, how does how does the universe come to be caused? It can't be dollar bills all the way back, right? There has to be a start. Aristotle ended up in the unmoved mover, right? There has to be sort of a necessary being that's always existed, that's uncaused, that starts the whole thing. Right? But how does he start the whole thing? Uh, to say that the unmoved mover is causing something for these scholars seemed inappropriate because typically a cause uh, exerts energy, right? It somehow loses some energy or moves, right? Particularly because at the science of this time, there wasn't, magnetism wasn't quite understood yet, invisible forces weren't quite understood, so causation was largely thought about as, billiard ball type, particles bouncing against each other. They did think of atoms, um, as maybe possible basic building blocks, but they were the way things happened is atoms bumped into each other. Things had to be moving. Well, the unmoved mover is not moving. So how does he cause something if he doesn't move, right? Was the idea. And so here's how he does that um, through emanation, right? So emanation is largely defined negatively, right, as not causation. It's identified with a sort of intellectual activity, and they describe it as sort of an overflowing of the unmoved movers, uh, being, right? It's intellectual power, and new intellectual powers are created from that. Uh, if that is vague, the notion is vague, right? Again, it's largely defined negatively, just like I don't know if we'll get into it, but if you get into philosophy and you start talking about the nature of the soul with Descartes, right? Um, Soul is typically defined as, well, it's not physical, right? But often there's not much else to say about what kind of thing a soul is. Similar here with emanation. It's not causation. It has to do with spirit or mind, right? And that's about it, right? So it's a way of creating things or a way of causing things that's different from the normal way of causation is basically what we can say about emanation. right? But the Islamic scholars did latch on to emanation, and they thought that there were a series of 10 emanations, right? And down at the bottom, at the last one, you start to get the world that we know it of, people and animals and tables and chairs and things like that. So it takes a lot of emanations from the unmoved mover to start to get into the physical world. Um, yeah, it is an open question that some of these philosophers asked. Well, how do you get physical stuff from emanations from a pure intellect, right? Where does that transition happen from? You've got mental stuff generating mental stuff, and then all of a sudden you get tables and chairs and rocks. Uh, yeah, that's a good question. We can't get into it here, right? But these are some of the questions they try to address. So the most well-known Islamic philosopher, Ibn Sina, is often known as Avicenna in the West. Um, Hugely influential, born in 980 C, so now we're getting towards like 1000 AD, right? He was a Shiite, a kind of a child prodigy in science and math and various areas, and eventually became a physician. He was sort of a wandering doctor. Uh, he Interesting guy. We can't get too much into his personality, but he died kind of young at age 58 from I don't know, they say drinking and sleeping around. Um, but he was born during the sort of the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, which was a big, powerful caliphate. Um, when at the time when earlier philosophers than Avicenna were thinking, this is our model of the rational universe, and the caliphate is just where it needs to be, is the running things uh, with the caliph at the head and so on. In Avicenna's time, it was getting hard to believe that that could be the case, right? Because the empire was in decline. So he was working more with pure logic and pure rationality, and he offers some proofs of the existence of God, some proofs of the nature of the mind. His flying man argument is very interesting. That proves that we're a soul. Um, and we'll dive into his proof of the existence of God. So there are many proofs of the existence of God. We'll cover two today. I may cover Descartes later on as well. It's an interesting, I think, thread to follow as we look at world religions. So he begins in his proof of the existence of God uh, with just the evidence we get from our senses, right? And our own experience and the way our minds act on our sensory evidence. So he says, look, um, everything we encounter in the world is composite, right? It's made up of other things. So I'm wearing a watch, right? You see it. The watch has hands, right? It has the glass on the top. It has the wheels inside and the band and so on. And you could keep breaking things down, right? Uh, the hands are made up of metal, and if you break it down into molecules and atoms, right? So um, flowers have parts, rocks have parts. So that seems obvious. Yeah, everything is composite. Maybe it gets down to the basic uh, units at some point. Um, but he says when we understand this, we typically think the simpler parts to be more basic, sort of metaphysically prior than to the complex, right? Um, Again, my watch. Before we had my watch, we had the leather, right? The leather is more basic than the watch. Before we had my watch, we had the metal that they used to make the hands and the face. That's more basic than the watch itself. You start with the basic building blocks and you build up. Right? Um, so that he takes to be sort of self-evident, right? That's just the way our minds work. That's the way we seem to assume that the universe works. Um, and then he takes as another sort of axiom that the universe is a rational, consistent whole. So if our minds naturally work in a certain way, um, it must be consistent with the nature of the universe, right? Our minds aren't accidental. And so if we tend to think, again, that the more basic or the simpler is more basic than the complex, then then that must be the case, right? Because the world is rational and should be intelligible to humans. Now, you might doubt any of those premises, right? Why does the world need to be intelligible? Why do human brains need to be in touch with reality at all? There's responses you could make, but these are plausible assumptions to make, and it is in the background of, um, a general religious worldview and an ancient worldview that understood um, the universe as a rational sort of thing. Okay, so let's take that to be the case, that the complex is contingent on the simple, right? If I didn't have the parts of the watch, I wouldn't have the watch. That seems clear enough. The existence of a hammer is contingent on the existence of the handle and the head of the hammer. Okay, he's also taking it as an axiom that you can't keep breaking stuff down forever, right? If I keep trying to break down my watch into its parts, eventually I will get to the basic atoms or basic parts of the universe, whatever those happen to be. Um, that's still the case. I mean, now we're down to like we have electrons and protons and then quarks and possibly strings if you're into string theory. Um, so we keep breaking things down, but eventually we do seem to think also that eventually you'll hit the basic unit, right, of reality. So that's all he's saying there. Nothing to be, not everything can be contingent on something else. The breaking down stops somewhere. The thing that where the breaking down stops um, isn't contingent on something else, and therefore it's necessary, right? It's a necessary being. It must exist. Um, and so he has proven so far, if you accept some of his axioms, which are reasonable enough, that there must be necessary being, right? There must be the purest, simplest type of existence. And he says, yeah, that is God. That's the unmoved mover of Aristotle. That's a little bit of a leap too, right? Um, but he says there must be something that's completely simple, it's completely pure. He identifies it with rationality, and it emanates all other existence, right? So, this is a quick summary, right? We could dig into his actual writings, and maybe some of these things that are apparent gaps in his logic would be filled in. That's a history of philosophy sort of endeavor that if somebody wants to write that paper, you can, getting into Avicenna's argument and trying to fill in the gaps for us. Um, but that's the general outline of it. Uh, you don't have to believe it, but there's a lot of the steps are plausible, except for I don't know, maybe the last one that identifies the simples with God. So he also thinks that the emanations, right? If the universe is created by emanations from God or the unmoved mover, it explains how humans can have knowledge of God. Now, each emanation is a little bit sort of a copy of a copy. It's less perfect than God himself, but since it is an unbroken chain of intellectual emanations, that means that the human intellect, which is towards at the end of it, can reach back, right, and sort of understand God. So it does make sense of how we could get in touch with God. We are an emanation of God himself. And in particular, prophets like Muhammad model this, right? They are able to uh, grasp the nature of God. Uh, Now, Muhammad wasn't necessarily doing it intellectually, and I think Avicenna thinks this might be an intellectual process here. But okay, so by the time we get to about 1000 AD, right, which is when Avicenna was alive, now we've got the West and the East clashing. We've got the Crusades. Now, Rome had fallen 400 AD. You had the Dark Ages where you had sort of Germanic tribes. You have the era of, Charlemagne but the European civilization starts to get its act together, right? Islamic civilization had been thriving. The West had been a bit backwards for a while, but we're starting to get larger empires. England, um, France, Spain, things like that, and the Holy Roman Empire. I don't think Spain wasn't around yet, actually. Um, but the Crusades start to happen, right? These are Christian kingdoms, and they get it in their head that they need to go back to the Holy Land where Jesus lived and conquer it. And so there's a series of crusades where they start doing this, and so now we get sort of conflict, but also interaction and trade between the Western Christian civilization and the Islamic world and the Byzantine Roman Empire, which is still around, right? And they're Christian. Uh, so at the time, um, Christian theology and philosophy had been practiced this whole time, mostly in monasteries by monks that were, occasionally raided and burned by Vikings, but, managed to survive. Uh, Christianity had developed the Western uh, part of Christianity, which is now Catholicism, had developed a tradition of saints, right? So you had various saints, and throughout history they've kind of played a similar role to these polytheistic deities. We've seen that the general public has a tendency to want to kind of be polytheistic, and the saints kind of satisfy that urge, right? You can sort of be many crusaders were a little more devoted to like their particular saint than to an abstract god, right? It's a little bit easier to think and pray to and talk to a more anthropomorphic, person, right? Um, so Jerusalem was conquered by the Western Christians in 1099, and it was pretty vicious. The Jews and the Muslims were attacked and killed. So we have this conflict going on. And so in the meantime, Christian scholarship is moving on, and um, the Muslims sort of got a head start on us, but uh, I say us because I'm I guess a Western person, right? But these Western Christians started to uh, get the Greek philosophers translated into Latin, right? Um, and so they were able to read them as well and start to think about maybe making Christianity compatible with Greek philosophy as well. So in 1054, you have the Eastern and Western churches, right? The Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church breaking apart, and differences in doctrines are starting to emerge. So the Western Church is starting to modify the Nicene Creed a little bit. For example, they say now the Holy Spirit flows from Jesus as well as God the Father, making Jesus and God the Father a little more equal, which is kind of a move against Arianism. If you remember in our lecture about Christian doctrine, Arianism was the view that Jesus was originally human and became God. In the Catholic uh, tradition, they're saying no, Jesus is God, was always God, is equal with God. Charlemagne, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, kind of the head of the biggest biggest empire in Europe, uh, wasn't really a theologian, but he said, sure, well, he approved that change to the Nicene Creed. So Western Christianity is starting to develop in its own direction. The Greeks, did not want to change the Nicene Creed as well. In general, the Greek, and Russian and Orthodox, right, the Eastern Orthodox Christianity was less interested in the philosophical approach. They said, no, God is mysterious, right? Incomprehensibility is part of the point. So there was a split. Around this time, Islam was also starting to drift away from the philosophical approach and more towards mysticism. So Western Christianity was getting into philosophy just as Eastern Christianity and Islam were getting out of moving beyond their philosophical phase. Not that there wasn't, a philosophy going on, but it had sort of peaked in the East and was starting uh, to take off in the West. So Saint Anselm was an 11th century monk. He offers another proof of the existence of God. It's very famous in philosophy of religion. It's called the ontological proof of the existence of God. Ontology just means being, the nature of what exists, right? So here is Anselm's proof. I'm going to give you two versions because people often find the first version a little mind-bending. So he starts with a definition of God. He says, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So what that means is God is that being, whatever being, the greatest possible being that you could ever think of, right? That's God. Whatever perfections you can hold together in your mind, that's God, right? The greatest thing you can conceive. Okay, so that's the first thing, just a definition of God. Then he says, here's something I take to be true. Things that exist in reality are greater than things that exist only in the imagination, right? So a actual pizza is better than a pizza that I'm wishing for in my mind, right? Reality is more than just ideas, right? Reality is better, it's greater, right? So if you take that to be the case, right, take that definition of God and then this basic principle about reality being greater than ideas, now we can do a sort of what we call a reductio, which means we assume that God doesn't exist or assume God only exists in the imagination and then prove that that can't be true, right, that that's sort of contradictory or absurd. So suppose that God only exists in my imagination. Well, if that were the case, then he would not be that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived, because I could conceive of something better. I could conceive of God actually existing. So, if a God that exists only in the imagination is actually contradictory, it's contradictory to its very definition, because by definition, it's the greatest thing that can be conceived. So, a non existent God is not the greatest thing that can be conceived, because an existing God would be greater, right? So, the idea here is since we can conceive of God, if that's the case, he must exist, right? Because by conceiving of it, he necessarily exists. That sort of seems crazy, probably to you, but the problem is it's find the flaw in the logic, right? The logic is actually fairly strong, right? Here's another version that a later, a more contemporary philosopher has offered. It's the same argument but phrased differently, right? So to understand this argument, you need to understand. We've discussed it before, right? Things can be contingent, meaning they need something else to exist, or things could be necessary, meaning they need nothing else to exist, or things can be impossible. So circles are necessarily round, right? In fact, round circles are necessarily exist because just by definition, you don't need like an actual circle drawn for circles to exist. They're mathematical objects, right? So round circles are necessary objects, right? Um, Pairs are contingent objects. I'm a contingent object. I could exist, I could not exist. Circles have to exist, and they have to be round. Um, Square circles are impossible. They can't exist in any universe, right? Because by definition, a circle is round. It can't be square, right? Um, so this is what we mean by necessary, contingent, and impossible. These are the three types of being that things can be, right? Most everything you see in the world is contingent, right? But some things could be necessary, mathematical truths, God if he exists, and some things are impossible, like um, square circles or I don't know, rocks so heavy you can't pick them up. God can't pick them up or whatever, right? Okay, so given those three categories of being, which one is God, right? Which category does God fit in? Well, by definition, God isn't contingent, right? If God exists at all, he's got to be necessary. He's not a thing. He's not the sort of thing like me or a table or a chair that might exist or not exist, that lives and dies, right? Um, if God exists, he's not contingent, right? But also, God isn't impossible because his existence is perfectly conceivable, right? He's not like a square circle where you can't even like picture a square circle. We could perfectly well conceive of God as, yeah, an all-powerful, all-good, right, all-knowing being. Okay, well, if God isn't contingent and he's not impossible, there's only one option left. He must be necessary. And if he's necessary, he exists, right? So this is another version of the ontological proof. I don't know, maybe if either of those make sense to you, or if at least they're intriguing and you want to try to make sense of them, you're welcome to write a paper on it. Now, in all of these, we're simplifying these stories a lot, right? There's always philosophers going on trying to make religions rational. There's also always uh, mystical folks or skeptics trying to keep the religion mysterious, right? And this was the case in Christianity as well. Uh, Saint Bernard, right, for example, um, thought it was arrogant to suppose that God could be proven by rational deduction. And he said, no, the point of Christianity, the whole essence of Christianity is love. Like, love is not a rational thing, right? You're not supposed to go around guiding your actions by reason and reasoning yourself into what to do. Love is supposed to be guiding all your action. That's all you need as a Christian, right? Um, but I don't know, these people are all complicated. He was also a supporter of the Crusades, right? So he seemed to think that one way that your love for Christ could manifest is by killing Muslims, which seems a bit odd, right? Um, but, just to say there were different approaches than just the philosophical approach in the, you know, where are we? We're post 1000 AD, right, in the Western Christian world. By the time we get to 1200s, we get maybe the biggest name. Avicenna is probably the biggest name in Islamic philosophy. St. Thomas Aquinas is probably the biggest name in Christian philosophy. Uh, he produced a multi-volume work called the Summa Theologica that attempts to integrate Christianity with Aristotle and Plato, and he's still woven into Catholicism to this day. We discussed earlier in the class natural law theory. Um, And that whole approach, which is still dominant in Catholic Church, derives largely from Aquinas, taking Aristotle and trying to integrate it into Christianity. And he compiled all the proofs of the existence of God that had existed so far, from Aristotle on through Avicenna and so on, Anselm, and kind of put those all together into one volume as well. So that's a quick overview. I haven't come close to discussing every Islamic, Jewish, and Christian philosopher in the period. I didn't really discuss Jewish philosophy at all. Maimonides, uh, a big name, but we just, I don't can't do everything. So I wanted to take a few things and maybe look at them in a little depth so you get a sense of what the philosophy looked like. Um, so Ibn Sena, Anselm, Aquinas, they all offered various arguments. I tried to look at uh, their rational methods by looking in more detail if they're proofs of the existence of God. And we'll see this again. We'll revisit, I think, a proof of existence of God when we get to Descartes, who's in the 1600s in the Enlightenment era. Um, and sometimes they will try to expand and improve on these arguments. Sometimes they'll say this argument doesn't work, but here's another one. But this is sort of an unbroken tradition in religion, is to try to make it logical and rational. And sometimes that's popular, sometimes it's less popular, but it's always there. All right, I will see you next time.